Welcome. Welcome to Moving Movements, Women in Philanthropy. My name is Katherine Gund. I'm the director of the Vera List Center for Art and Politics at the New School, and I thank you very much for coming. I also want to thank the Women's Legacy Project at the New School, which is a co-sponsor of tonight's event. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting here on Lenape-Hoking, unceded territory that was first inhabited by indigenous peoples, the Lenape among them. While we welcome you to our event, we are the uninvited guests of this land. I will offer a few introductory remarks, and then Brina Sanger will take over and offer her reflections, and at that point we will then ask the panelists to join us here at the table. Moving Movements is both. It is the coda to the New School Centennial Festival, or a coda, the exuberant week-long celebration of the founding of the university 100 years ago. And as the title implies, it is also a proposition for the future. As we look at the historical role of women in philanthropy and reflect on the current controversies around museum funding that span the scales of the individual trustee to some of the richest and wealthiest foundations in the entire world, we propose that A, philanthropy is an intellectual endeavor, and B, that it is feminist-informed philanthropy that can transform our cultural organizations into more social justice-driven, inclusive, and resilient spaces that boldly assert their civic roles. In particular, this afternoon we will address some of really pressing and urgent questions. Among them, for instance, given the extraordinary wealth disparity, how exactly does a feminist approach to philanthropy address glaring social, political, and economic inequities? Given the thriving movement to decolonize our institutions, how does feminist philanthropy help clarify the role that financial support must and must not play therein? And how does feminism-inspired philanthropy align with artists and art to advocate for social change? Women as philanthropists and as intellectual leaders have also been the founders of the Vera List Center, and I just quickly want to acknowledge Vera List, who was a sculptress. She was a student here at the New School, a civic leader in numerous non-profit organizations, and a collector who initiated and funded art centers at 5 universities, the New School being one of them. More recently, gallerist and philanthropist Jane Lombard has spearheaded an international fellowship and social justice initiative here at the center, the Jane Lombard Prize for Art and Social Justice, which we will celebrate at the end of the month, and there is more information on that program in your programs. In the 100 years of existence of the New School, the field of philanthropy has seen extraordinary changes. The Virilis Center, for one, was founded in 1992 in direct response to the culture wars, when debates were raging in Congress and on the streets on whether the arts, whether there was any public benefit to sponsoring and supporting the visual and performing arts, or if the federal government should simply eliminate support of individual artists. And it did. To this day, the National Endowment for the Arts has still not reinstituted funding for individual artists for fear of other newer, younger Karen Finleys, Robert Mapplethorpes, and their likes. Today, I think the debate on funding of the arts is a very different one, catalyzed by political movements such as Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, Standing Rock, and others. The question is no longer whether the state should support the arts, but more essentially, what constitutes a cultural institution? Is it just the programming, or is it also the building it inhabits, the land it occupies, the labor relations practiced within, the funders that finance it? And if we embrace such a comprehensive definition of cultural institutions, how do responsibilities shift? Who are the institutions accountable to? When are they successful? I am thrilled that our panelists are experts whose work is nothing short of groundbreaking, and I thank them very much for sharing their insights into intersectional feminist perspectives in philanthropy of the arts. They are Cecilia Clark, Brooklyn Community Foundation, Michelle Coffey, you'll see them in a moment, Lambent Foundation, Katherine Gund, who represents the Art for Justice Fund, Pia Infante of the Whitman Institute, and Holly Lee of the Asian Women's Giving Circle. I am also really honored that Bryna Sanger has agreed to moderate our panel and the conversation among the panelists, a deputy provost at the New School and a dear colleague of mine, and I'm thrilled that Mary Watson, the Executive Dean of the Schools of Public Engagement, will offer closing remarks. I thank them all. I thank our students very much who've worked on questions that will show up later in the Q&A. I thank the board of the Vera List Center for Art and Politics, and I also want to especially thank Ariola Pira, curator at the Vera List Center, who has organized this program. And with that, Bryna, please follow me.
Well, welcome. This is an exciting moment for me to be involved in this project. I'm particularly thrilled because it's the celebration of 100 years at the New School. And with our distinguished panel, who I'll introduce shortly, we can explore a topic that has particular relevance to the history and lived experience of the New School. Some of you may have been at yesterday's panel as part of the Festival of New. The Women's Legacy Project, which was led by Professor Gina Walker and her colleagues, has excavated the stories of self-identifying women in the history of the New School. They were among a majority of our founders, and it's a fascinating story of both the centrality of women's roles in contributing to the intellectual conception of the New School and their courageous philanthropy in building and sustaining a radical new idea of a university. Clara Meyer, Dorothy Payne, Whitney Straight, Vera List, under whose name we gather here today, are sort of dramatic examples of the women who have done so much for the New School. They and many others whose stories have recently been rediscovered are in many ways responsible for this conversation that we're having today for moving movements. Because in 1919, at the time of our founding, and some would say even now, the New School represented a radical break with the past and a risky experiment to reach beyond the ivory tower, to open its doors to the city, to educate the civic class, welcome radical ideas and intellectuals, artists and civic leaders to help shape a modern education, and that paid off. And the singular vision, work, and philanthropy by women had a lot to do with its evolution and success from the very beginning. Moving movements in philanthropy is presented by the Virilis Center as part of this project that honors this often invisible intellectual and philanthropic contribution of women here at the New School and elsewhere. As part of this week-long interactive festival of the New, the Vera Center, under Karen Cooney's incomparable leadership, looks at gendered activism and social justice-oriented philanthropy and what it means today and has meant historically and may mean in the future. I think I'll just make a few comments about women's wealth. We know that women's wealth is rising, and women of high net worth give more than self-identified men, and that they give differently. Research on women's giving concludes that women tend to view wealth as a means by which to articulate their value set. Women are at the forefront of philanthropic engagement and impact. And we know that donors of color are different in their patterns and motivations for giving as well. With our principal question for today of what difference self-identified women and women of color make as they increasingly assume leadership roles as donors and grant makers, this panel is important. Increasingly, there are legitimate concerns about the significant inequality of wealth, as Karen said, in the US and the role that private giving is having in politics, social, and cultural life. Today, the question of whether women's increasing roles and an intersectional feminist approach to philanthropy can and do help organizations and movements that are more social justice driven, inclusive, and effective has particular importance. And we have just the right panel to discuss this and how this might work both on the ground and in the broader institutional level. Our panelists, who hail from philanthropic and cultural institutions, community organizations and private foundations, artists and activist groups, will help us explore the challenges and discuss how values and resources might be better aligned to transform their organizations. So let me welcome and introduce our panelists. You have in your program a detailed description of their incredible biographies, and we're going to draw on that throughout the presentation. But let me just mention that first that Cecilia Clark, who is the president and CEO of the Brooklyn Community Foundation, has successfully managed and developed nonprofit organizations in New York City with an emphasis on social justice and community and cultural advancement. She joined the Brooklyn Community Foundation in 2013, and she's led a holistic transformation of its strategic grant-making, community leadership, and asset-building activities. And just to give you some sense of that, under her leadership, the foundation has grown significantly, raising $16.5 million and distributing over $7 million in vital funding to community partners in 2018 alone. This is why biographies matter. Before her current role, Cecilia was the founder and executive director of the Sadie Nash Leadership Project, an award-winning educational leadership project for low-income women from New York City and Newark. And she was previously the executive director of the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture, associate director of the Drawing Center, and led government fundraising at the Brooklyn Museum. So you can see how deep the experience is here. Next, we welcome Michelle Coffey, the executive director of the Lambent Foundation. She designs, implements, and furthers the strategic agenda, the leadership and vision of the Lambent Foundation. Prior to her creating Lambent in 2009, she was director of the Story Night Fund and the senior philanthropic advisor to Tides Foundation. She serves on many, many boards in the arts and in social welfare more broadly. Through innovative grant making, she has had to explore the impact of contemporary art as a strategy for promoting sustainable cultural practices. Katherine Gund is a filmmaker and sits on the board of Art for Justice Fund. Founder and director of Auburn Pictures, Katherine is an Emmy-nominated documentary filmmaker, producer, writer, and activist. She recently incubated Just Media, the criminal justice reform film and cultural database. Gund's production work focuses on strategic and sustainable social transformation, arts and culture, HIV/AIDS, and reproductive health. Her films have screened across the world in theaters, museums, festivals, universities, and so on. Pia Infante, co-executive director of the Whitman Institute in San Francisco, is a trustee and co-executive director of Whitman. Pia draws on decades of multi-sector experience as an educator, facilitator, organizational development consultant, executive coach, nonprofit management, business owner, writer, and speaker to advocate for trust-based practice. Pia speaks and teaches on radically embodied leadership and trust-based philanthropy. We have so much to follow up on in our questions. And finally, Hallie Lee is the founder of the Asian Women Giving Circle and co-director of Donors of Color Network. The Donors of Color Network is the only national project that is engaging and networking high net worth donors of color across race and experience. The Asian Women Giving Circle raises resources for Asian American women using the arts to bring about social change in their community. In 13 years, the circle has made grants of over $1 million in support of 80 amazing projects. She is part of a co-design team thinking about what might undergird the burgeoning collective giving movement nationally. Finally, I'm lucky to have my dear colleague, Mary Watson, who's the executive dean of the Schools of Public Engagement, to make some closing reflections. She was appointed dean in 2014. Prior to that, she held a faculty appointment and a number of administrative positions at the Milano School. I'm delighted that she's here today to help us out. So I think we should begin. I think I'm going to go sit.
Should we sit? You want to sit down?
Yeah.
We can sit. Okay.
Okay, our panelists have, as you saw, quite different biographies professionally, having taken a lot of different routes to get where they are, and different models or approaches to philanthropy. And not all are funding girls and women either, but the panel looks more broadly at the way self-identifying women and women's institutions give and with what impact. So I thought we might begin by asking a question of each of you to briefly describe how you come to this work, and if you may have been influenced by or internalized a feminist philanthropic practice either before you got into this work or while you've been doing it. So do you want to begin?
Should not have sat at the end. Anyway, my name is Cecilia Clark, and I'm president and CEO of Brooklyn Community Foundation, where I've been for 6 years. And prior to that, I founded and ran a feminist leadership program called Sadie Nash Leadership Project. I ran that for 12 years before going to the foundation. In terms of feminist practice, I would like to say that I hope that in all my work as mother and nonprofit worker and now philanthropy worker that I practice feminism. But certainly creating Sadie Nash and working with all the extraordinary women there, I think really sharpened my viewpoint around feminism and especially around racial justice. And I think that that was a big learning curve for me at Sadie Nash. When I was approached about the job at Brooklyn Community Foundation, just quickly, community foundations are 501c3s that essentially raise money to give money away. But this particular community foundation had started as a bank foundation, and while it had actually been going as a community foundation for 4 years, it was still kind of practicing like a bank foundation, complete with bank officers as the board. And so I made it pretty clear from the outset that that would have to change. And that has changed. And I would actually say that while I certainly have not abandoned feminist practice, again, because I think it's in all parts of my life and my work, we've actually taken a very clear approach around racial justice. And that was actually the dictate of the community itself, because when I got there, we did a 6-month project called Brooklyn Insights, because I decided that as a foundation that represented a community, I really actually had no right to determine what the vision for this new foundation was going to be, so we took it to the outside. And we talked to over 1,000 people over this very clear process. And one of the things that emerged was that as a foundation representing Brooklyn, which is almost 70% people of color, if we didn't address racial justice, or I would say really structural racism, as a root cause of the inequities that were all the other conversations, we really weren't going to be effective for our defined community, but I would argue for any defined community. So I would say that probably really our approach is intersectional between feminism and focusing on racial justice.
Hi, everyone. My name is Holly Lee. It's really nice to be here. Thank you for convening us, Vera List Center in the New School. So I guess my short answer is that I come from a long line of badass Korean feminists in my family, from my grandma and my mom and my aunties and my cousins. And and my first job out of college was organizing pro-choice marches in the Midwest, and getting hate mail written in blood, because it was a time in our country, and now here we are again, 30 years later. And I think for me, like sort of an American-style feminist awakening, I would say, happened for me in college. And then years later, I've worked in nonprofits my whole life, and I'd been on the grant-seeking side for many years, and then I got to be on the board of the New York Women's Foundation and learned what an incredible group of aligned feminists can do in terms of organizing and harnessing resources to support women and girls in New York City. That was kind of my philanthropy college. I'd been an ED of a domestic violence organization that serves the Korean community in New York City. And then I'm Korean, so there's this thing in Korea called a ge. Shinhee Han was one, we've been in several ges together, where people pull money and give it away, and a lot of times it's women who are doing this. So taking that idea, that cultural concept, and turning it into a philanthropic vehicle was the birth of the Asian Women Giving Circle. And in 15 years, is Chitra here? She was, hi Chitra! So Shinhee and Chitra are part of the Asian Women Giving Circle together, and we're turning 15 this year. And we have moved over $1 million as an all-volunteer group of women into our communities in New York City to projects led by Asian American women who are using the tools of arts and culture to bring about social change, progressive social change in their communities. I wear another hat in this room, which is the Donors of Color Network. We're building the first ever national network of wealthy individuals of color who are aligned around racial justice, economic justice, and gender justice. And I can talk about that later.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Michelle Coffey and run Lambent Foundation. I work with one individual donor. That's the source of the money for Lambent. And it's a long-standing, intimate relationship. And so Anne identifies herself clearly as a feminist and a friend of all of us here. And you know, I think my ability to be here is really from generations of folks before me, specifically in the philanthropic sector, thinking about Claudine Brown, Joan Shikagawa, Roberta Bedoya, feminists who were inside philanthropic institutions, who were intentional about making space, about making certain that there were the next generation to pull forward and bring in. So I have been nurtured, cared for, and supported in my entire career by feminists. Our radical practice and intimacy is a part of Lambent's philanthropic practice. So it's embedded in us and embedded in me because of where I come from.
Hi, I'm Katherine Gund, and my mother is Agnes Gund, and I think she always says that she is a lateral thinker and that all women are lateral thinkers. They don't imagine where they are and go to where they want to be, that some men would do that. And I think her intuitiveness and her willingness to keep going towards problems instead of running away has influenced who I am and what the work is that I've done. And there was a lot of activity in college, but then when I think being queer always put me on a kind of intersectional view. And the first philanthropy I was involved in right out of college was the Australia National Lesbian Action Foundation, which I was on the board of, and then shortly after or during, I was one of the founders of the Third Wave Foundation, which with Amy Richards and Dawn Martin and Rebecca Walker. And I think one of the big lessons around Third Wave was, again, trusting our instinct, which was that we could trust women, trust young women, trust trans and gender they were the first organization that got with the program of understanding gender nonconforming and trans women. And I think this idea, what we said when we started, and I was the oldest of the four of us, and we said it was targeted to women and girls between 15 and 30, but that once you were 35, you had to cycle off the board. And everybody said, all our wonderful mentors, of which there are many and they're important, said, you can't do that, you'll lose all the historical memory. And we thought, well, we're going to do it anyway. And we didn't lose the historical memory because I'm still a part of it. And I think there's lessons all along the way of sort of how, what I've learned from my mother and my peers and the people I work with, which has always been a very integrated group, so that we don't say, oh, I'm an activist, I'm a philanthropist, but always recognizing that those things live within us, that all of these intersections can actually hold the same space. And I want to say one thing that I love that's been a dominant sort of, it's not a metaphor, a dominant way of seeing the world in the last year or so is when I was talking with Ava DuVernay once, and actually filming her. And she said, I said, what's the relationship between art and justice? And I should back up and say, Aggie's focus has really been on women and girls and education, but all of it seen through a lens of arts and understanding that the arts is really where we can make sense of what's happening to us and make sense of the past and take us into be able to imagine. And Ava put it so succinctly recently. I said, what's the relationship between art and justice? And she said, art is about imagination and justice is as well. And that what you have to do is imagine something that's not there and believe that it can be there, that it will exist. So an artist creates this art, and activists are also imagining creating a world that doesn't yet exist. And I would say that's my organizing principle.
Hi, my name is Pia. These are my squad goals. Hashtag. Feel very, very honored to be here. I mean, personally, these terms like philanthropy and feminism wouldn't make sense in the culture of my Filipino family. I came here when I was like 5 from the Philippines. But at 5, you really couldn't tell me that moms, aunties, grandmas, and eldest sisters didn't in fact run the world. I mean, the context of, we could just call it feminist women's leadership, it was very formative in my young life. I felt like dads and uncles were sometimes helpful to carry stuff. So I've evolved in my understanding. But I will say that sort of just personally and culturally, while no grandma or auntie in my family would actually use the phrase feminism or philanthropy, I feel like they in fact are deep feminists who don't actually have to have like this overlay of a framework or a model that has been created in a capitalist system, which I'm sure we're going to talk about. So in terms of how I ended up as a trustee and a co-executive director of a private foundation called the Whitman Institute, which has been trying to advance a concept called trust-based philanthropy for the past 5 years, very much not by design, very much by accident. I started out as a teacher here in the Bronx, and so my career took a Gen X-y circuitous path. And because I never thought when I was 12 years old, I'm gonna grow up and be a funder. But I do feel like the question that comes up for me, being in a role in which I get to think about the question of whether or not the capital that is accumulated that creates inequalities can be successful in addressing them. You know, I think it's just a particular conundrum, right, of this role. And if it were up to me, everyone in the role would be a feminist of any gender, right? Anyone considering this question, anyone in decision-making seats, anyone who is a gatekeeper for resources for this time, I would hope would be a feminist in some way. So happy to talk about any of that more, but that's how I would answer the question.
This was really a helpful setup for me, I will say, because it's often suggested that women give in quieter and often more invisible ways than men give, if creating no less impact. But again, in our re-engagement with the women's history at the New School, and more specifically at the Vera List Center, we learn what important roles women have played in founding and funding institutions, as well as giving their time and talent. In our earlier years of our history, when women were really pretty invisible, even though they were doing these remarkable things, they are now recognized as sort of uniquely feminist in the way they approach things. Think of the settlement house movement that really was directed toward women and children. But after many years of giving away $5.5 million to female mid-career artists, it was recently revealed that Susan Underberg was a private donor behind Anonymous was a woman. I mention this specifically because Michelle's Coffey's, Lambent Foundation is funded and founded by a woman, and Katherine's mother, Aggie, is a well-known philanthropist in the arts. So that's sort of a basis for thinking about how these women have influenced sort of the legacy of giving that you all represent. And I wonder, maybe, Michelle, you could start with you dealing with this. I mean, there are women who have influenced your work, and how does that reflect or respond to calls for greater gender equity and social justice in the art world and beyond. And then I'd love to hear what the rest of you have to say as well.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned anonymous because Anne is her name, but we wouldn't even acknowledge her name 12 years ago when we started our working relationship. She was very intentional to be anonymous. I like being anonymous. We really are individuals who like to be behind the scenes. It is just recent that we've been pushed out, and I would say we've been pushed out by our partners to actually speak about our practice. We are individuals who believe there are bigger visionaries and that they should have the space, but recognizing that we have to step in further to be seen, because that is actually power, and that it is important for power to be made visible. So we've decided to practice that a little bit more. We are Anne, wealthy white woman, I not a wealthy white woman. And so race and class and privilege and access is very active day to day in our relationship. And therefore, it is very active and front and center in all the work that we do. We both, she's a working artist herself. I was trained at the Walker Art Center. That's my aesthetic training. She began funding women's foundations here in New York and nationally. I was working on death penalty reform and drug policy reform and fumigation issues. After about 30 million of her money moving to support progressive movement building, in 2007 we had a rumble in our guts and realizing not only were people not in the streets, we weren't in the streets. And so what were we going to do about it? If my role as a philanthropic advisor is to promote progressive philanthropic curriculum for Anne so that she understood the process and the practice of work being done on the, not even on the forefront, because we're really not in the forefront, but we also recognized that we weren't in the streets, and therefore how to, we believed strongly in art and beauty and that it has a role. It has a role alongside of organizing and advocacy. So that's how we started Lambent Foundation. If I may go a little bit more and actually speak that it's not just about giving grants. We are intentional about 3 landscapes: New York, New Orleans, and Nairobi. We fund in New York because it's our home. New Orleans for 2 particular reasons. One, art and culture is fused in the daily fabric. There was no justification needed for it, and very few philanthropic dollars moved below the Mason-Dixon line. So it was a political statement. And Nairobi, because a full belief in the African diasporic flow. We on this side of the country, this side of the Atlantic, understand a West African aesthetic signature, but not aware of an East African aesthetic signature. And really believing that cultural practice, indigenous and contemporary, come from lands, and artists and cultural workers and cultural producers work in an isolated way. And if we can think about money not being the central, but bringing value, how do we elevate so that people can begin to see each other? So that's a little bit of the journey of being anonymous to why we need to be more vocal.
Sure. There's so many things to say. It's hard to know which thing. But I would say just in terms of movement building, that one of the organizations I haven't spoken about that I've been involved with, that Pia's actually been somewhat involved with, is called Solidaire. And the idea behind Solidaire was not to be a giving circle, but actually to bring together people to fund movements who have way too much money and know that they want to actually strike at the root of the problem, to say that there shouldn't be people, we shouldn't figure out how to do philanthropy well, just like I feel we shouldn't figure out how to do incarceration well. I think we should change those things. And Solidaire, I was one of the earliest members of Solidaire, and it came out of Occupy and then Black Lives Matter, and there were a lot of things happening that were bringing people together who said, how are we going to go beyond this idea of even sharing decision making, which I think is popular and important, and people have been struggling with that for a while and trying to figure out how. I mean, I loved that you spoke directly about who the people are that make up the fund, and that's how the decisions get made and the priorities get set. And I would say that brings me to Art for Justice, which my mother began in 2017. She sold one of her most prized paintings, which is called The Masterpiece by Roy Lichtenstein. And she put $100 million from the proceeds of that to fight mass incarceration, to end mass incarceration. And it was a way of literally turning art into sort of magic money, because that money it doesn't exist. And it's sort of one of my favorite parts about the Art for Justice story is that she bought it for, I don't even remember, I don't think she even actually knows how much she got it for, in the 70s. And then suddenly there was this money that she could do something with, and part of what she's doing is trying to get her community, that art collector community, to start realizing what they need to do and how they need to participate. But the reason I raise it in terms of this power sharing and decision making is that she, and maybe we'll go into this more, but I know you could speak to spend downs, but is that she decided she was going to spend all $100 million in 5 years. So instead of creating an endowment, which would then maybe give away, I don't know, do the math, $500,000, $1 million a year forever, she thought several things. One was now the window's open to end mass incarceration. It's one of the only bipartisan, if not the only bipartisan issue these days. So that we don't know how soon that door is going to close. Another was that she doesn't want to see mass incarceration keep going. So the idea is we're going to put this money out there and actually end it, and then we can go on to do other things. And I think the third, really, for me, is about this power sharing, is that she was saying, I don't feel like I should be making all these decisions. I don't know how to solve these problems. I'm not one of the most impacted people. And there are many, many people who've been struggling and fighting against this for decades, obviously longer, but the mass incarceration issue that has exponentially grown up. We have 5% of the world's population in this country, and I'm sure everyone knows the statistic, but we have 25% of the world's prisoners. It is it's there. I could go on and on about the prison industrial complex, but what I think it did is it said, I'm going to just put this money out and let everybody else decide how to use it. So to be able, and I'm on Ava and I and Darren Walker from the Ford Foundation are on the governing board of this, and part of what we're saying is, we can make a $7 million grant to people who can then decide among themselves how it needs to be spent and how it needs to be done. So it sort of gets rid, I think it moves you very quickly out of the sort of bureaucratic or administrative cycle of sort of us saying, how are we going to move this money? And I think we each deal with that in such different and exciting ways. And now is really a time to keep challenging each other to step up and say, I'll give one example and then I'll stop, is one of our big anchor grants is to the Equal Justice Initiative, which people should go immediately to see in Montgomery, Alabama, where there's a memorial and a museum to the legacy and history of lynching, which I feel is one of the first big sort of statement pieces about reparations, that it is finally saying this is a step that we're going to take to go in this direction. And Art for Justice gave a huge anchor grant to that. We rarely talk about it, and people say, and this comes to your point about anonymity, is how do we use that power without pretending that we're the important part of that equation? And so we don't talk about it, and people keep saying you should talk. Aggie doesn't talk about anything, which is why she's not here and I am, because I talk and she doesn't talk about it so much. But but I think what was really important for me was to understand that we weren't helping Brian do this, that we weren't one of the key, most important pieces of this most important thing that's happening right now, but that the way I see it is really that we got out of Brian's way. We were part of saying, Brian, do your work. Like, we're going to get out of your way, not we're going to make it possible for you to be the genius leader that you are and that we need right now, but more, how can we
That's
make
really
sense of that?
helpful. Hallie?
Can I just riff on that for a second?
Yeah,
So
sure.
there's so many awesome, I love this story, which I've heard before, of your mom and transforming. Two things that I just want to lift up is really magical, I think. The transformation of that money. Like, money became magical and curative and healing in this instance. And your mom was the genius that figured out she could do that. And then the other thing that I love about it is Aggie is an organizer. So if you go back 30 or 40 years to women's philanthropy, sort of the birth of women's philanthropy, like the Women Donors Network, the Women's Funding Network, who were some of the other ones, like New York Women's, Texas Women's, Helen Hunt, and Leah Hunt is like taking it to a whole other level, right? Women moving like. So those donor communities were really important for those women, many of whom were inherited wealth, white women, creating donor communities to do this thing together, like to get out from under the thumbs of their uncles and their grandpas and their brothers, right? To do this thing called philanthropy and to build philanthropy and services and resources for women and girls. There's something about those communities, however, that was sort of donor service-y. Servicing those women to learn together, be in community together, and that's obviously really important. But I think what's evolved now, 30 or 40 years later, with Solidaire, the network that we're building, Donors of Color, it's not about donor services, it's about donor organizing. You know, how can we switch the thinking to, like a slumber party, an awesome slumber party for my girlfriends to do this thing, which is awesome, you know, but what can we do, what's the impact in the world that we can have together if we can use our privilege as people who are organizing money and organizing wealthy people's money to open doors, bring people along, and make the change that we want to see in the world.
Thank you. Sure.
Can I make
Go ahead.
so?
Sure.
I think in everything that you just said, there are lessons for traditional philanthropy. I think that we've all read, maybe raise your hand if you've read any of the critiques of philanthropy that are out there, Edgar's, you know, Phil's. And thank you for naming that it's decades long that women have been operating in a way that is a get out of the way, prioritize the leadership of those most impacted for a long time, right? So if we redefine it from just critiquing the traditional philanthropy, we could say there is a philanthropy that exists, that has coexisted with a more patriarchal sort of charity model that is much more in solidarity with communities. We in my operation just call it trust-based philanthropy. I often call trust-based philanthropy training wheels for learning how to share power, in case you don't know how. Just, you know, give unrestricted support. Commit for more than 18 months, right? Don't make people exhaust themselves writing things you're never going to read. Get out from behind your laptop. Actually be a learner. Try not to call yourself a strategic expert in an area you literally know nothing about, and you're calling yourself that because you have money to give away. And I feel like we can problematize in some ways professionalized philanthropy, of which I have to admit I am a member of that class of folks. But I think that there is something in these stories where we can say the critiques are great, and there exists ways of being that we just need to tell the story of and resource more and emulate and model, right? And it's and I will, just to distinguish, my co-executive director is a feminist man, and I just want to say you can be a feminist of any gender. And I think that the way that he practices has always been a feminist practice. And when we asked so we're spending out our endowment, which is another point to make around kind of, is it a time to sit and build wealth, or is it a time to circulate it, because it's definitely raining. And if you were saving it for a rainy day, it's like tsunamiing. So there's stuff we can say about sort of how traditional philanthropy can operate. But I think in a previous conversation, the tea that we just had, I think it's really important to lift up models of people that are doing. So in addition to these stories, I would throw out there Thousand Currents, which is another kind of community foundation, and Durfee Foundation in Los Angeles, Liberty Hill. I mean, there are folks that are just doing it, and it's often feminist woman-led or feminist some other gender-led, but the point is, it is a thoughtful way to understand that just because we are in positions to make decisions about how money gets stewarded does not mean we are the experts, does not mean we are the leaders of the social movements that we're trying to support.
Well, this leads right into what I was going to ask you all about, which is really, what are the different approaches that we have that are new, that are different, and that can further these sort of moving movements, ways of thinking about philanthropy, and how do we influence what you might call traditional philanthropy to understand and to take up some of the approaches you're talking about, whether it's funding circles or any of these different sort of modes of operating. What are the ones that are most powerful, and what are the ones that have the potential to sort of spread in the community more generally?
One of the benefits about being a community foundation is that we're not obligated to the rules of private philanthropy. So we are not obligated to give out a measly 5% of endowment. We can do advocacy, we can do lobbying. And so that's given community foundations writ large a lot of freedom to disrupt philanthropy and to show up differently. And so we're sitting at the table with private philanthropy, but we can start saying different things about it. So definitely internally, we're always kind of saying to ourselves, okay, are we gonna push philanthropy on this? Are we gonna stand out on this? So we've done a number of different things. Actually, almost more of our portfolios are actually externally advised on than internally advised on. I do have a program staff, but we have a very hyper-local funding stream right in Crown Heights, which is the location of our foundation. It's completely resident-led. They decide where that money goes. Again, kind of acknowledging that what the hell do we know about Crown Heights? We're going to go with the people who live there know about it. We have youth-led grant-making. These are young people who are deciding on youth-led social change projects in Brooklyn. Again, what would we know about young people and what they really need? And those same young people advise on our largest portfolio, which is Invest in Youth. So we have done a lot of this kind of what we would call disruptive philanthropy in addition to trust philanthropy. Just recently we launched, it doesn't even actually have a name yet, but we started to look at almost 50% of our grantees are run by people of color, which I was incredibly disappointed about when I saw the pie about a year ago, and then I realized that actually the pie in the United States is that philanthropy funds about 98% white-led organizations. So then my measly 47% started to feel okay. But what we also started to realize is that the fail rate among people of color-led organizations, especially women of color-led organizations, was incredibly high for all of the reasons that we all know here. So I don't need to go into that. But we thought, well, we should let's take this on. So we actually launched kind of a women in leadership, women of color leadership program. But we started, of course, with women of color, and my program officers convene them a couple of times to find out, well, what the hell's going on? And one of the big messages that came through is, well, we're good. We know how to run these organizations. The problem is philanthropy. And so then we actually realized, really, we need to support the women of color who are running these organizations. And by support, I mean, last week they went to this extraordinary kind of healing spa / whatever space in Brooklyn, but it was just a really beautiful thing. But in the meantime, actually, we need to look at what are the philanthropic practices that are not allowing women of color access to funds and access to support so that they can actually make these organizations successful, because honestly, they really are, those are going to be the most successful organizations. So these are just some of the different things that we're doing.
Yeah, please.
So the Donors of Color Network, when we think about it, and we get to build it from scratch, which is a total luxury. It was 3 years of research, but 6-month-old network. We're not really building a philanthropic network. We're building a power network. And from the very beginning, we're thinking about power. What are the arenas in which a group of people, especially a group of wealthy people of color, what are the arenas in which we can be most powerful as a collective? And if you look at the arenas that we can operate in legally in America, the C3 philanthropic network is actually tiny. It is dwarfed by government as a lever of power and by private sector impact investing venture funding. So we're building those 3 things. We have a C3 to build our donor network, and then we have a C4 to build the advocacy, government policy work, at the same time, and that's going to be actually more powerful. And we're building funds within each of these things. We're also adding and building a fund that's going to have to do with impact investing in entrepreneurs of color who are working in the areas that we're identifying, like climate, culture, narrative change, and politics and democracy reform. The Giving Circle world is also extra philanthropy. Like, for many years, people who've been building giving circles and collective giving vehicles in America were not even allowed to join these philanthropic things that exist. You know, the Council on Foundations and New York Regional Association of Grant Makers and blah, 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 blah. And so after years of just not being let in, we were like, well, screw it. You know, we're just gonna build our own thing. And if you look at giving circles and collective giving networks across the country, they are moving billions of dollars outside of structured, organized philanthropy. Many, many, many of them, I don't remember the number, I can get it to you, are led by women. There's been a really exciting growth in political giving circles after the 2016 election, people just getting riled up and pissed and organizing themselves to, you know, everything from knitting pussy hats to writing postcards to now raising serious money, funding state legislatures, DA races, which we know is fundamentally important to who gets prosecuted and who goes to jail around the country, and sheriff's races, among others. It's incredibly exciting. And a lot of this grassroots philanthropic work that lives outside of organized, structured philanthropy is being led by women and young women of color.
Could I, just as a follow-up to that, do you think that's the only way to get these things moving, is give up on traditional philanthropic approaches and go outside to build your own? Because that's essentially what you did.
Well, people of color have not been invited to sit at these philanthropic tables in America. So we can beat our heads against those brick walls forever and get lots of bruises and scratches and stitches, or we can build our own thing. And I mean, I think many of us up on this panel think that philanthropy ought to not exist. You know, like there's a role for government in our country, and the government is not doing feeding people, educating people, providing health care. I mean, in an ideal, if we could just like wave a magic wand, philanthropy would be pushing research, doing weird, pushing art, like pushing the boundaries of the things that our government and taxation policy couldn't do, right? There's a role for philanthropy, but it's not to do the function of government.
Jump in?
I do want to jump in and maybe show some of the inside of a practice, the internal philanthropic work, because philanthropy has one thing, a major thing, money, but it also has resources and influence. And so one of the things that we're trying to do, and I don't mean to sound flippant or dismissive at all, please, I understand that money's really important, but if we can move that quickly, multi-years, larger amounts, so that we can actually focus on what are some of the shared resources that we can offer with our partners for really collectivity. And so it's not just the grant making going out. That actually can now be done automated. You know, we're changing our staffing. So it's not, we don't want to hire program officers anymore. What might there be a curatorial role that pays attention to the values and practices of our grantee partners, so that there's a network, and really thinking about network theory so that people aren't working in isolation. How do we really partner with exhausted executive directors? Specifically, so many of our arts organizations' executive directors, women of color, unhealthy. It's a sad state right now. So how do we pay attention to boards? And if that's a way that we could look at the misalignment between boards and executive directors, and really be able to be on some boards that really think then about power and race and transition, and because those are also individual donors, you begin to start to develop a progressive philanthropic curriculum for us all. We can also look inside our practice and disrupt. We can sit around tables that may be focusing on human rights and talk about the arts. We could be sitting around art tables and speak about racial justice. We could be around women's tables that speak about climate change. Like, we can be specific about where we show up as well.
Yeah, I would love to. You know, I think that what we're talking about is how we have to constantly be pivoting this idea that, you know, we don't want to get comfortable with what we're doing because it's obviously not the answer yet. And that, you know, we are always shifting and changing and questioning whether it's philanthropy or, you know, the question is about how to change traditional philanthropy. And another board that I'm on is in Cleveland, is the George Gund Foundation, started by my grandfather. And I'm about to become the chair of that in a month, which is kind of crazy because it's a very traditional philanthropy. And to me, the way that we're going to change it is to realize that part of the pivoting is about that if we really are going to alter the power structure, we're going to have to give things up as philanthropists. And that's why I like what you were saying, Holly, about that it's going to, you know, philanthropy in and of itself, reinvented, could be something that, yeah, would be great. You know, if the government was being the lawyer for the people, as Anand likes to say, like there is a purpose for the government, and we want them to do their job, and then we could do something else with this imagination and this sort of envisioning a world we want to live in and not be stuck. And I think one of the things we're trying to do is at the Gund Foundation now, or that we're about to try to do, is, you know, Cleveland is a black city. It is a majority black city. You wouldn't know that from the power, who's on boards. And so, you know, creating ways to increase democracy. So, you know, and create democracy and repair democracy allows us to go in and say that, now I lost what I was saying. Oh, that we had started with going towards advocacy and then we went to policy change. You know, there are ways to look at the structural as opposed to these, you know, direct services, but that if you actually bring people in who are imagining something other than being a philanthropist, but they're being a power broker or undermining their own power, constantly reaching out and involving other people. I think that's what we're trying to do in this way of sort of, I was going to wear a shirt, but then I got too hot, that says all lives matter. So the V is missing, but the space is there. It's a Hank Willis Thomas piece, but I think it really speaks to this idea of how does equity take us to equality, and why is calling equality as if it exists now a problem? You know, which is the whole all lives matter. It's like we don't live in a space where we can talk about all lives mattering yet. So we need to approach things in a more equity-based way, and I think that's what the work of people up here are doing.
P, I wondered if you could in particular bring to this conversation what trust-based philanthropy is really about and what the value of it is to what we're talking about, and also this radically embodied leadership that you talk about.
That I have to embody in my body. I mean, I think both of those concepts are about wholeness. It's about being whole in these roles and encouraging wholeness in these systems that actually really reinforce bifurcation and I can't think of the word right now. But silos, yeah. So, but in terms of the question of what do we do? Is it about creating all new vehicles? How do we transform? How do we transform into magical energy what feels like, you know, a sort of a dead in the water, huge Titanic of a sector? And was that vivid?
Yeah. And to the point.
Sunk, already sunk.
I try. But one of the things I want to say is that there are radical approaches about either lifting up, you know, women's cooperatives in Guatemala, you know, that where women have generated their own like $1 million just by creating financial cooperatives of their own. You know, supporting that to happen in other places, in the global south here. So supporting these alternative models that I think some of the groups that have been mentioned do. I think there is also some value to be had around thinking about who is inhabiting these roles of power and how we are inhabiting them. So I think that there are lots of foundations and funds and efforts that say things like equity and ending inequality like as their flagship, but the experience of being in relationship with those institutions is terrible. Look at Ford Foundation's last program officer perception report, right? There's something around how we show up in the relationship. So Cindy Suarez, who is a theorist of power outside of in Boston, talks about in this time in society, it can become overwhelming to look at your Twitter feed and think, how the hell, right, are we gonna climb out of this one? You know, I had a baby 10 months ago, and I wonder, when she's 18, is she gonna have to wear a gas mask when she walks to school, or is she gonna be able to walk to school? Where is she gonna go to school? So anyway, these things all happen in my mind, but one of the things I think about is that the site of relationship is a place where we can practice how to share power. And I think that the women that have been described here today are practicing what it's like to be trustworthy themselves in the relationship where they have more power. And what does that look like? It looks like humility, it looks like listening, it looks like what's been said, ceding power and sharing power. And the very brief story I'll say is that the foundation that I co-lead, which is spending out our resources by 2022, in case anyone is looking for a hire in 2022, we're spending out our resources very intentionally because we know that this is an imperative time in history to model that and to advocate for that. But in doing so, I'm going to try to finish my thought. Oh, so my co-executive director, John, is a feminist white man, lovely San Franciscan, and he could have held on to what happened when the donor decided to leave the foundation and the endowment to his staff as opposed to his children. Right, so he made a decision, the donor did. And when the donor did that, John, who did not come from a family of wealth, could have said, cool, I have millions of dollars to decide what I want to do with. But actually, he similarly to what I heard here, understood that it wasn't his, even though he inherited this role, it didn't feel right for him to make the decision singularly. And he diversified the board. He brought me on as a co-executive director. I think I might be the only out queer Filipina trustee of a private foundation that I know of. So, and the board, I'm just saying, if you know her, someone else who's not me, I would like to meet. Like the movie Us. So the board intentionally also, just to keep playing it out, like internal to an organization, decided to, even though he had pre-existed me in the institution for 20 years, gave us the same salary package, the same retirement package. So demonstrated in the actual actions of hiring what it looked like, right, to be equitable and feminist, and then told that story. And then he often says that and now I've been in the seat for 5 years, he says that it's much more satisfying to have given up power, and he feels like the impact that we've had with our core grantee partners, our nonprofit partners, and in the sector in terms of influencing our peers maybe to give more unrestricted funding or to do all these things, has actually been greater because he gave up power. And I think that is a story we want to tell, that in giving up and sharing power, we are actually creating a greater pie, right? And it feels like, for some folks who might think, why would I want to give up power? Like, it's taken me a long time to kind of get to a place where I have power. It's really the idea that to redefine power, we become more powerful together, and we have to give up some of our preferences and our decisions. He funded only white women-led organizations, you know? And when I came to the role, I said, we really need to examine this, John. So anyways, I think there is a story to be told about the benefits of sharing power, and I think that's part of what creates a trust-based ecosystem in our sectors.
This is a fascinating conversation. We're coming to the end of our time, and we need to start with questions and answers. I have two other areas that I hope when we have some questions they'll hit upon, and that is the domestic versus the international. Not all of you give internationally, but the question of whether the same sorts of approaches are relevant and valued and have the same impact internationally as here. And the other thing is, some of this kind of giving is also quite risky. And I wondered what you think are the virtues and the risks of the kinds of things you're doing. So maybe that can come up in the question and answers. I guess we're going to have people come up to the microphone who want to ask a question.
Hi. Hi, everyone. I'm Henry. My mentor is Joe Solomon, which I believe you know. And and he talks about the 100 trillion transfer of wealth in the next 30 years. And so my question is, what advice do you have to generational younger wealth holders about investing in plans like the Green New Deal and the Just Transition and the oil to soil economy in alignment with SDG goals, if it's not too big to ask?
Anyone want to jump in?
I was about to
Wait,
say, is there
resource
any
generation?
resource generation person here? No.
Could I just say something
started
about,
that
I
from
don't,
third
this
wave.
is not going to answer your question, but I've just been thinking about it, and it came up in the T, which is when we look at that wealth, and especially in the structure of, first of all, can we just say that philanthropy, as it is structured right now, of course, mirrors capitalism, right? It's beautifully constructed to conserve the wealth of what is essentially white men. Most of the money in these foundations certainly were built surely on enslaved labor, certainly on exploited labor, and certainly on exploited environment. So already the root of a lot of that wealth probably should be looked at. And then the idea that you get a tax deduction to make charitable donations is interesting and, of course, very wealth conserving. And in addition, philanthropy is only required to give away 5%, which begs the question, what are you doing with the other 95%, right? Which is kind of crazy. So one thing I would say to people who are coming into money is, you don't have to just give away 5%. And I love that the examples up here have been like, you know, social change is expensive, right? Because a lot of stuff is super messed up, right? So we really need to I think that if we can just think broadly about the different kinds of structures, and ideally there will in fact be movement building around making tax code different and making philanthropy different. But one thing I would say is name what that wealth came from, try to change that. What are you invested in? Right? So in one moment you're funding soup kitchens, and the other moment you're funding the cafeterias in colleges that are in fact owned by private prisons, right? So that doesn't make sense. So I would say look at sources of wealth and think about how to disrupt wealth and to question it.
And I would add, never do it alone. Not only in this time period with other funders and organizations doing it, but we have to be in collaboration with each other. Shared learning, practicing better accountability, and humility. So do not do it alone.
One of the things Third Wave Fund did was look at some of our the organizations that had preceded us, and we ended up creating this Making Money, Making Change conference for young people between 15 and 30 who had more money than they needed. That was how we defined it. And so there were inheritors. There was actually one person one year who had his family had won the lottery. There were people who had medical settlements. There were people who had earned money. And it developed into what's called resource generation, which is we call it, you know, and then that developed into solidarity. So there's ways to grow up in community, to your point, and I have 4 kids between the ages of 15 and 23, and so I spend a lot of time talking to them about this. I mean, they grew up in they're African American, they have queer moms, they're like already in a very different art world environment, super political. So, you know, they're already on a shift, but I think to the question, what I love is that they don't even think the Green New Deal is like risky or interesting or far out. They're like, duh. So, you know, I think that's what my hope is for that generation. I mean, as you can see, my mother gave all her money, is giving all her money away. So we're not going to get one of these big, huge transfers of wealth, but there are a lot of people who are. And if their parents are believing that they're doing that because some of them are going to be able to make this difference, then they're setting them up to be able to think that way and feel empowered by the money and be the ones, maybe they're saying, you have a better idea. You know, you give it away or give it to the people who are already thinking about it. But I think it's a great question, and we've been talking about this for decades, how there's going to be this transfer of wealth, and it's already happening, so.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. So my question, I would suppose that folks in the audience would can share with me, in that what does philanthropy look like when you earn less than, say, $80,000 and you're looking to break down these networking silos. So like, for example, I'm a community organizer, activist at heart, but I work for a state senator. So one of the things I did over in Westchester County was I networked all these different community-based organizations for the purpose of streamlining the process of getting from problem to solution, given that we're always hearing about budget cuts, cutting from the state level, X, Y, and Z. So to do that, it was like, okay, let me put everyone together so we can get from X, Y to, yeah. So like, yeah, what does philanthropy look like when you earn less or your capacity might be a little less?
Hilarious. We were able to be in conversation with some of the students earlier before this session, and I had recommended that we consider ourselves philanthropists, all of us. So even if it's 80,000, if it's 24, if it's no money, we are practitioners. We are philanthropists ourselves. We have all spoken about how tithing, and especially within the Black community, if we were to look at that, we meaning Black folks, would be some of the largest funders in the country. So yes, we have to consider ourselves philanthropists. We also have to recognize that money is not the center here. It is our time, it is our resources, it is our relationships, and we at this time get to redefine it. So I would say identify ourselves as a philanthropist and let's define ourselves. That is not necessarily based on what our work desk look like right now.
We all come from generous traditions. You know, if you go back and look at your grandmas and grandpas and great-grandmas and great-grandpas, we all have a giving tradition wherever you come from, and we can all tap into that. The research that we did for the Donors of Color Network, we interviewed 112 people across the country. All of them are wealthy and none of them are white. Cumulatively, they're giving away $60 million a year. You know, 112 people, if you just add up their annual giving, it was $60 million, so they're moving a lot of money. I would say, you know, let's think outside of the philanthropic sector. You know, like one of the things I love about the Green New Deal, kind of to combine your two questions, is that it's thinking about investment strategies, government strategies, and philanthropic strategies, right? So if we think about like what we want to accomplish in the world to move the needle on whether it's criminal justice or repro justice or climate crisis, the impending climate that we're in, philanthropy is not going to do it. You know, like we have to think about all the ways, all the things we can move. And some of them are stealthy and sneaky and underground, and some of them are very loud and bold and public. Like what are all the ways that we can do it? How can we be strategic and ninja-like and move and PR, marketing? What are the ways that we can do it? And if we think about all those different arenas that we can be powerful in, if you bring people along with you in network with your buddies, you don't have to call it a giving circle. It can be your neighbors, it can be your work friends, then you will be greater than the sum of your parts.
But I also think that, you know, if we're serious about ending income inequality, there won't be this sense of like who's a philanthropist, who's not, which would completely shatter that definition. And I feel like, you know, the sort of fear and hoarding, someone told me yesterday I should write a book, fear and hoarding instead of fear and loathing, and because that's what people are setting themselves up for in the Bay Area and everywhere else in the country, but because you live there. Not you, but because you have to live there. I mean, I don't know how you can stand it. But this idea, I mean, it's true. They have so much money and they're so scared of everybody else. And one thing that my mother's been very active in is being one of these, I don't know how they call it, but very wealthy people who are calling for taxes on the wealthy people. And they're, you know, we think that's a no-brainer. There are actually very few of them. There are like 60 of them. Well, some of them are members of that, but who have been writing the letters and, you know, the op-eds and really saying, like, we can't have a situation where some people have more money than everybody else and then they're deciding what to do philanthropically. Like, you know, this whole idea that a lot of people are talking about these days, that you can't be hoarding, accumulating, you can't be about, you know, extracting money and then also be saying, I'm going to give away some to support the idea that there wouldn't be inequality. But I spend all my time taking money. So we just need to smash that, and anybody can do that.
In fact, I would just argue that for the people who make less than $80,000, actually, your opinion about economic justice is exactly what we need. I would actually far prefer to hear what you think your solutions are to economic injustice than somebody who's worth $200 million, right? So the more that we can kind of funnel down that way, the more it really makes sense.
Well, I think we're
Thank you.
coming to the end of our time, so one more question? Were you waiting for? You waiting? Yes. Okay, one more question.
Oh, thank you. Hi, my name is Hashem. Thank you for taking time to share your thoughts with us here in this setting. I'm from the Bay Area, but originally from New York. And finding my way back to New York. And I work at Apple, and my question, new to philanthropy, with my wife Mary. And so what we're trying to work through is, who are the organizations that are radical, that are rethinking philanthropy in new ways, that are going to break down these boundaries, like you just said, Kat, between like what is a philanthropist, who is going to be at a stage at the New School in 10 years talking about their impact, and in an Apple sense, if I can use this phrase, like who's thinking different about this, that are women-led and minority-led. I'd love to hear from each of you, like what an organization you think has that potential and why, and it'd be very, very helpful. Thank you.
I feel so. My mic's off. No, I got it.
Okay, here I'm back. It's because they don't want me to talk about being from San Francisco. Before I answer your question, which is a lovely question, I want to say something about, we have not talked about the capital being accumulated by the tech sector in the place where I live. And we talked earlier about, Silicon Valley Community Foundation was a place where a lot of tech billionaires have parked monies in ways that are very unaccountable. One thing I will say about the wealth accumulation that's happening, I think there is a fear in hoarding premise, and I think there's also an obsession with being innovative about it. So I just want to complicate and challenge and problematize a little the need to have something shiny and new. There are many grassroots movements that are led by women, both in this country and to answer your question, internationally, that already exist. They're not the innovative new donor-advised fund. They're just an existing grassroots group that has been doing their work for decades and helping people to, the people who are disproportionately affected by climate change, for instance, or disproportionately affected by economic inequalities and political inequalities, refugees. Like there's tons of organizations. I think that some of the avenues to them, just to answer your question, Harsha, is I think Thousand Currents, I've mentioned them a couple times. I'd say Solidaire has new leadership, Vinny Bansali, and I feel like she's about to break out with some ideas for how to directly support women, indigenous, and youth-led social movements globally. I think they are a resource. Obviously the people up here are doing incredible work. I just want to invite us to think, is it so much that we have to do something new, or is it that we have to make visible, the invisible efforts that oftentimes, the invisible work that is often held by women or feminists with a feminist lens to that gender role. So that's what I would say to that. And just a final thing is, I do think that there is something about retraining our minds about what it means to be philanthropists and how to inhabit these roles. And so we do have the Trust-Based Philanthropy Project, which you can now find online, which is a term-limited project that is not trying to create a new affinity group. It's not trying to create a nonprofit, and it's not a consulting firm. It's literally like just peer practitioners who want to share with other peer practitioners things that seem to work and be in a learning community about it.
Thank you. Mary, do you want to give us some concluding remarks, please? Oh, sure. Michelle, you want to make a final comment?
Please do.
It doesn't have to be an organization. We do not have to follow into this trap of the 501c3. It can be individuals. Just move your money and make it bring you joy. It does not have to be painful and hard and all time consuming. Let it be joyful.
Okay, well, that's really a great way to end with joyfulness. So, and also with the provocation about what is the new. So let me just say that standing here representing the New School, celebrating its 100th anniversary at what's being called the Festival of New, this leaves me a very provocative question to respond to. So let me just say what I heard overall from the panel. 100 years ago in 1919, when the New School was founded, as Karen was mentioning, there were many interesting and famous and important philanthropists at that time. And I think what I heard you talking about are new strategies that you've been using to actually respond to what you're calling traditional philanthropy, to actually address some of the core principles. But what I heard threaded throughout the conversation was a model of a different way of lifting up collective power. So I'm going to tell you what I heard as the summary of what you all recommended. So we know that the so-called, let's call it traditional philanthropy, which is certainly what was in place 100 years ago, was really about marriage and family resource flows. It was about doing that in a patriarchal lens and thinking about the way in which patriarchy both aggregates resources and power and actually leads to the power and visibility of those individuals. That the answer to that aggregation, which was aggregated mostly through organizational systems, was to create other organizations to disaggregate that money that had been previously aggregated under the patriarchal and, I must say, capitalist practice, which was all about extracting resources and then figuring out how to either decide what the priorities were or to redistribute those resources to other things to address what Pia called, and you had a lot of great lines, I wish I'd been tweeting, dead in the water, huge Titanic. So that was worth repeating. So what I heard you say instead is that what we've been doing is we've been addressing these things sort of incrementally. So we're saying not patriarchy, but maybe feminism. Not power, but maybe networks. Not organizations, but maybe new resource flows. So let me summarize what I think I heard the group say about what the future holds. So you're calling for a radical movement building of wealth movement in our society towards social and political aims that is done by individuals and networks, people who are operating from their values and their whole person perspective, groups of people who are intersectional, fluid, non-binary, persons of color, globally oriented, but operating from their full identities, that are not just creating networks, but they're making the choice to cede power to the community and to the collective, and also recognizing that this has been done for generations since the beginning of organized society, so that's going to be done by making visible the practices that we already know that are working. That there should be substantive issue involvement in this mobilization effort. So it's not just about perfecting practices of distribution, but actually working substantively on the issues, whether it's environment or mass incarceration or other kinds of issues. And that we have to get over the idea that hoarding is not innovative. Actually, distributing and sharing is where the innovation is. And then finally, that this practice should all be about social cohesion, social change that actually addresses some of the ills of our current capitalist society, that we should disrupt the ideas of thinking about wealth in solidarity with one another. And so this substantive leadership and leverage of collective networks with a badass attitude, I had to say that as well, is the way that we're going to move this forward in a new model of what we're thinking about, what collective movements look like. And it's not really new because there have been collective movements of this kind since the beginning of recorded history. So that's my closing comments. Congratulations, all of you.